All right. Welcome to Psychedelically Speaking. Thank you all for being here. It's U Ottawa's monthly speaker series on psychedelics and consciousness. We meet the second to last Tuesday of every month, usually at 5:30 p.m. Our event next month may shift, so stay tuned for that. Um, and I'm excited today to introduce Paul Gillis-Smith. Just some background. He's a program lead for the Psychedelics and Spirituality Initiative at Harvard's Center for the Study of World Religions. During his studies as an MDiv at Harvard, he studied the history of psychiatry as it relates to psychedelic medicine and chaplaincy, with a specific focus on quantifying mystical experience through the MEQ and things like that. He's also worked in ketamine chaplaincy and co-produced the Harvard Psychedelic Walking Tour and co-facilitated the center's first reading group on psychedelics and religion. Um, Also, I want to plug that Paul is co-teaching the Psychedelic Universe, a course over the summer with Christian Greer, who has been on the series here before. I had the pleasure of taking that course last summer, and I highly, highly recommend it. I'll throw a link in the chat. I believe the um, application deadline is February 2nd or something like that, but I'll let Paul confirm. And yes, I'm excited to hear about Lisa Bieberman. I've had the pleasure of hearing Paul speak about this a couple of times already, and each time I just get more interested in this fascinating figure. So I'm really excited for today. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for that generous introduction. February 2nd sounds right. I'm not for certain, but I'll let you know. Well, it's great to join you all on this fine evening. Many thanks to Nathan on behalf of the University of Ottawa's Students for the Advancement of Psychonautic Studies for the invitation to the Psychedelically Speaking speaker series. And for the past year or so, I've been conducting archival research on Lisa Bieberman, who is a psychedelic spokeswoman working out of Harvard Square in the 60s and the early 70s. She worked for Tim Leary and Richard Alpert briefly for their organization, the International Federation for Internal Freedom, or IFIF, in 63 and 64, after she had graduated from Radcliffe College, Harvard's sister school. And in 1965, she started what she called the Psychedelic Information Center out of her apartment and published a bi-monthly bulletin from June 65 until February 71, doing crucial risk reduction work by publicizing the changing state and federal drug laws in the US, among other things that I'll touch on in a bit. It was an incredibly uncertain terrain in this period before the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which is illustrated by her own run-in with the law in 1966 when she faced a case of entrapment by agents from the Food and Drug Administration for trafficking LSD across state lines without proper labeling. Now, I'd planned to give a talk on lessons that Lisa Bieberman may have to offer for contemporary psychedelic therapy and psychedelic risk reduction. But by happenstance at the beginning of this month, I spent a week in her archive reviewing her correspondence, papers, receipts, and all manners of other treasures. And this has pushed me in a quite different direction from what I'd planned to discuss today. What I'd like to do instead is provide a brief tour through some of these materials, stopping at some interesting landmarks and artifacts, some of which are there on the slide for you. And leaving us all with some questions along the way, and then conclude with one big question. What ever happened to Lisa Bieberman? Now, in 1980, the Bay Area newsman and contemporary historian John Bryan put out this book, Whatever Happened to Timothy Leary, which was a 20-year retrospective on Leary's introduction to psychedelics and subsequent adventures. Now, this presentation presents an alternate subject to Bryan's book. Now, sensible enough, as John Bryan relied upon Bieberman as a source for some key moments of his own text, namely the collapse of Millbrook, the commune that Leary and Alpert started shortly before they threw the towel in on the if-if. To read Leary alongside Bieberman is an interesting exercise, as in many ways, Leary was often Bieberman's foil for the many things that she saw was going wrong with the psychedelic movement, whether it was his turn to the East, to his psychedelic substitutes in light and sound shows, or to his insistence that the highest form of consciousness accessed through a high dose of LSD is the perception of reality as simply whirling particles, which she had no interest in. And if you are at all familiar with Lisa Bieberman's psychedelic period, or perhaps you've read the biography of her on Erowid, you may also have this question. So what happened to Lisa, particularly after 1971? Now we'll get to this year in a bit, but let's begin our tour at 14 Story Street, just 2 blocks from Harvard Square. Now, after her graduation from Radcliffe College, Bieberman briefly worked for Leary and Alpert, and Radcliffe is also based in Cambridge, just next to Harvard. So Bieberman worked briefly for Leary and Alpert, as I mentioned, in their newly founded if, the International Federation for Internal Freedom, which was probably the only organization at the time that was openly soliciting and distributing information about psychedelics to the public. And as their office secretary, Bieberman discovered a purpose, the distribution of the most current information about psychedelics on hand, helping people through this uncertain psychedelic terrain, often for the first time, and forming a national network and community of those interested in these substances. And she was also circulation manager for the Psychedelic Review during that time, which was the IFIF's flagship publication. Now, the IFIF collapsed in the spring of '64, and after a brief stint working at McLean Hospital, it's a psychiatric hospital just outside of Cambridge, Bieberman was looking for a way to revive the work of the IFIF that felt like a calling. And Paul Krasner, editor of the underground Berkeley-based mag The Realist, asked her to write a story on the IFIF. And in her first published essay in February of '65, she also, in the Realist, this issue, she also announced the launch of the Psychedelic Information Center. A few months later, she published the first Psychedelic Information Center Bulletin, which was a publication that would appear every other month without fail until February 1971. Now, to extend the tour analogy, the bulletins are like a well-maintained rest stop system on this journey, on Bieberman's journey. They're short, they're to the point, and they're incredibly helpful for anyone's basic needs relating to psychedelic information. Latest news on the changing drug laws. She would publicize literature that was available to order, including synthesizing guides of various chemicals. And it's also out of the bulletin that she launched the LSD Loan Fund, which was intended to keep activists out of jail. And it was, according to some of her readers, the most consistent publication on psychedelic information of its time. Now, they also offer, these bulletins, a connective tissue across her work in this period, as some bulletins would later appear as published essays. One such bulletin had some unintended reverberating impacts. In December of 1965, in her third bulletin, she provided a coupon for free LSD to whoever could provide it in person at the Psychedelic Information Center, also known as her apartment. Now, in her 1970 reissue of the first 12 bulletins, which I have here, I can't really see what it says. It says 2 years in the psychedelic movement, 65 to 67. So in the reissue, she reissued the first 12 bulletins, replete with footnotes, updating out-of-date information, and providing background on various items that she included in these bulletins. So in this reissue, she states, the LSD giving of Christmas 1965 was a turning point in my career. I did it for a number of reasons, partly as a demonstration that it could be done. I resented the thought that within a few months, the sale and distribution of LSD would be illegal everywhere, and that nobody had really taken advantage of the freedom we had to do this during the years up until that time. That is, LSD users had behaved as if it were illegal already and had gone underground. This experience had an unexpected effect on me. It turned me off to distributing LSD because I got a look at people who were asking for it. I felt that they were shallow in their motivation and attitude and had been taking too much LSD already, for no better reason but that they were bored. In most cases, I never heard from them again. In a few cases, I learned that persons to whom I had given LSD had sold it. If I had limited myself to giving away LSD at home, I would have been within the law. However, I succumbed to the temptation to send some to correspondents in other states, and as a result was later prosecuted under the old federal law for interstate commerce with a misbranded drug. It was misbranded because I hadn't put instructions for use on the label. I was convicted of this in December 1966 and put on probation for a year and had to leave graduate school as a result. She was enrolled in a PhD program in psychology at Brandeis in a town just next to Cambridge at the time. And the photos there are not of her trial. They are of the courthouse where her trial took place, but to receive, I believe, Lyndon Johnson in 1964, so around the same time. So just after her case concluded, Bieberman released probably her most famous essay or pamphlet of her entire life, The Session Games People Play, a manual for the use of LSD. Here it is. And in it, she details 9 games that people play during an LSD session that should be avoided. Why provide a manual for the use of LSD, though, almost exclusively comprising things that one should not do? Because if you can avoid the things not to do, in her words, quote, what to do should not be a problem. There's a list of the games there on that slide. Now, flashing forward a few years, in a one-page essay labeled Afterthoughts 1971, which she included with copies of the session games for those who ordered it after she, spoiler alert, ceased her own use of LSD. She says perhaps its name should be changed, the pamphlet's name should be changed to How to Use LSD If You Insist, along with the caveat that if she is less sure of the value of LSD, that she is less sure of the value of LSD than when she wrote the pamphlet. And that the best resource while taking LSD is to pray, which she did not know at the time that she wrote it. Now, later that year, 1967, Bulletin number 12 from June became a published essay, The Psychedelic Experience, in the August issue of the New Republic. Here's that issue here. For which she received a whopping $170 for her essay, over $1,500 USD, accounting for inflation. She revised and expanded this essay for the Boston Globe magazine in January of '68. So this essay has 3 versions: the first version in the Bulletin in June, a published version in the New Republic in August '67, and then in the Boston Globe magazine in its longest form in January '68. So this essay, or this set of essays with the same title, was a turning point in many ways. For one, she denounced the word psychedelic, stating that it had been ruined, perhaps beyond repair. Well, by whom? Well, by the psychedelic movement, and namely Tim Leary. When she published it in the Bulletin, she threatened to cease the publication of the Bulletin altogether. But she returned on schedule in August of '67 with Bulletin number 13. She continued to use the word psychedelic in the title despite her criticism of the word because, quote, post office is used to the present name, and I have this rubber stamp and all. And so it stayed. But her goal with the center and the Bulletin, as she states it, is no longer to tell people how to turn on, and she would no longer distribute synthesis procedures or recipes as, quote, the information problem on the psychedelic scene is less a matter of not knowing where to go to get high, as it is one of widespread misinformation and not knowing whom to believe, end quote. So the subsequent issues of her Bulletin also provided a more thorough treatment of her positive view of how LSD, of LSD and other psychedelics. This positive view was first called whatchamacallit, short for whatever you may call it, and later called phanerothym, after the word psychedelic had been ruined. Um, and this vision, this positive vision that she had an explicitly religious orientation. Her hope for both whatchamacallit and the what comes to be known as the Phanerothym Society was to found a center where anyone could take a psychedelic for religious purposes, but in the Quaker style. Now, it went through continuous revision, this whatchamacallit Phanerothym Society, between 67 and the early 70s. But its first full-fledged treatment was another self-published pamphlet, Phanerothym, a Western approach to the religious use of psychochemicals, released in April of 1968. She had it printed on a blue cover so as to resemble the Quaker pamphlets of her time. Now, why Quaker? Bieberman began attending the Cambridge Quaker meeting in the summer of 66, and not long after, she began adopting a Quaker approach to her use of LSD. The Quaker gathering, any Quaker gathering, is called a meeting for worship. And in Bieberman's words about the Quakers, though they didn't know it, they had the perfect model for using LSD. This is her quote: "You gathered deliberately, setting distractions aside, and sat waiting in silence for the movings of God's Spirit, or as one of their pamphlets called it, the mind of Christ. You spoke only if you were given by that Spirit a message for the whole group." Unquote. Now, this pamphlet, Phanerothym, is her first thoroughgoing treatment, or her first thoroughgoing attempt to spell out this Quaker approach to the use of LSD. But this technique was not yet explicitly Christian. In November of 68, a few months after the release of Phanerothym, the pamphlet, and just after she had been accepted by a local Quaker meeting, not the Cambridge meeting, but that is a story for another time, a session was in order. And with two companions, Bieberman set out for none other than the house of scholar of religion Houston Smith, which became an occasional session venue for Bieberman. And a few hours in, she experienced what she later described as her conversion to Christianity in a meeting with the man himself, Jesus H. Christ. Now, her written work from that point forth further takes a decidedly Christian turn. And the next 4 essays I will describe will illuminate this turn. These writings also found the smallest audiences, some left in manuscript form. The first of which comes from July 69, Dear Reverend Jones, Letters from an LSD User, a manuscript of over 100 pages that never seemed to see the light of day. The Reverend Jones in question appears to be T. Canby Jones, a professor of religion and philosophy at Wilmington College, a Quaker college in Ohio. And these letters essentially fit within the genre of Christian apologetics, defenses of or arguments for one's Christian faith. Now, the faith in question for Bieberman that she's defending is the combination of Christian Quakerism and LSD. Now, I'm unsure if she ever tried to publish this manuscript, Dear Reverend Jones, but it makes for a fascinating defense of LSD generally and of the place that LSD could play within Christianity specifically. Then in February of 1970, Bieberman began to circulate the essay, What God is Doing with Drugs, which was originally a talk that she gave at Wilmington College in Ohio, where the aforementioned Reverend Jones was a professor. Now, it was released later that year with minor revisions in the Quaker Quarterly, a publication intended for the work of young Quakers or Friends. Now, it is in many ways an explicitly Christian development of her Phanerothym pamphlet, and a significantly abbreviated version of the Letters from an LSD User, where she states explicitly that these drugs are from God, that the devil will also try to use them for his purposes, and that LSD was discovered as a gift from God to his people who have become spiritually malnourished. Later that year, she offered Is Phanerothym Un-Quaker? To the American Friends Service Committee, where she worked at the time. And like Dear Reverend Jones and What God is Doing with Drugs, it is also a work of apologetics for the Christian and specifically Quaker use of LSD. And in April of 1971, she had A Trip That Left Out Christ, published in Engage, a social justice-oriented magazine from the United Methodist Church. It was a revised version of a bulletin from earlier that year. And quite similar to the psychedelic experience essays from a few years before, it details her troubles with, oh, oh no, never done this before. Here we go. Okay. Details her troubles with the psychedelic experience. That is, her experience of being part of a psychedelic movement, not necessarily the experience of being affected by the drugs. But it has a more pronounced theological position. And from her essays on the psychedelic experience in 67 to her later work in the early 70s, I have gleaned what I shall call a theology of LSD. It is rooted in practice, first and foremost, and in a practice specifically of what she calls the 6 rules of phenerothym. They're quite simple. The rules are as follows. Do not take it more than once in 3 months. Take it at least once a year. Take it reverently. Plan the setting and the group carefully. Ask God's guidance before, during, and after. And if phenerothym gives you a clear leading, carry it out, but be sure it's clear. And she began attaching this to the bottom of every bulletin at some point in 1968 or 1969. Now, doctrinally, so we have the practice in place. And doctrinally, if that's not too strong a word, Bieberman viewed LSD, as have said, as a gift from God. And it was given at a time when it was needed most in the West, in a moment of deep spiritual malnourishment to her read. God is not the only one concerned with phenerothym, of course. The devil has his own interests in LSD as well. Finally, LSD can help one find a solid place. And what is a solid place? It is those things of which you can be certain, and they're typically quite simple truths. And this was in direct contrast to Tim Leary's view of consciousness, where the highest form of consciousness access through a high dose of LSD reveals reality as but a swirl of electrons. So rather than getting a random swirl of electrons, we have a solid place, a spot that one might mark and call their own. Now, this last feature, I think, is perhaps the most enduring quality of the theology of LSD that extended beyond her use of LSD, which you would also write about as marking a spot. And this phrase, to mark a spot, took on new life in 1974 as the title of her unpublished memoir, To Mark a Spot, A Psychedelic Pilgrimage, which I'm currently in the process of having published. Now, similar to the apologetic works of earlier, her memoir is also religious in genre, but it's not apologetics. It is her testimony, the story of her conversion and devotion to Christ. Now, she was no longer known as Lisa Bieberman at her time of writing, but Lisa B. Kenning, after she had married in 1972. And between 72 and 74, she wrote the 166,000-word manuscript, each chapter covering a year on her psychedelic pilgrimage between 1962 and 1971. Now, why does the story end in 1971? As she faced increasing difficulty getting her phenerothym society off the ground, as most of those involved at the time seemed to view it as, quote, Lisa's thing, she became more and more interested in devout Christian communal living. So for a brief time at the end of 1970, she even moved into a fledgling Christian commune in upstate New York. For what she sought through phenerothym, a center dedicated to the religious use of psychedelics, seemed nigh impossible to realize, even with big names like Huston Smith, scholar of religion, on the Phenerothym Society's board. Now, in her correspondence, I have found a tone of total despondence toward her collaborators on the Phenerothym project, with nobody interested in it as much as she, and certainly no one as interested in realizing the center for the religious use of psychedelics as much as she. So then on the 17th of April in 1971, she had organized a Phenerothym session with 2 companions and LSD as the chosen sacrament, as usual. And during this session, she received a vision of a cross and then a question from God about whether she would be willing to give up her other projects and interests for the sake of total devotion to him. Eventually, she gave in, and during the session, she reported that she no longer planned to take LSD, which remained the case until she died. Now, she did continue to advocate against the criminalization of drugs and drug users, not just users of psychedelics. And she even desired to be present for certain sessions of people in her life who had never taken a psychedelic before, as late as 1976, as far as I can find. But April 17th, 1971, was the definitive end of her acid Quaker period, and she saw her memoir as a way to, quote, wrap up that long period of my life. Now, skipping a few years forward, between the mid-70s and the early aughts, Bieberman and her husband left Harvard Square to the suburbs of Philadelphia. She began to develop her own religious movement with her husband and had a number of adventures in the Christian Quaker tradition. She changed her name from Lisa to Leisha, and I'm still not quite sure why. And she began to develop a unique fondness for a town called Farmington in Maine as early as 1977. She and her husband bought property there in the late 80s, and she moved there for a number of months in 1996. And this relationship with Farmington took many forms, but it reached a climax in 2005 when she convinced her husband to move there with her full-time on account of a prophecy that she received that this town would become, as she called it, the New Jerusalem. And she wrote the prophecy down in novel form in the spring of 2005, prophesying that the date for the New Jerusalem, or the coming of the New Jerusalem, would be the 6th of June, 2006. And she self-published this prophecy as Farmington, Farmington. Now, Lisa understood this book not to be written by her, but transcribed, taking down the words of Christ himself as she heard them. And I can attest to the distinct tone of this book from any of her other work, and not just for the lack of an editor, as I have read other works by her that did not see an editor. Its tone is haphazard, the plot is often confusing, and the characters' backstories are introduced without any clear reason why at times. For example, the story's protagonist, Kathy Lee, is to have said that both of her parents took their own lives, but there is no clear reason why this detail is provided to the reader. There's also the occasional I that appears in the narrator's voice, but it is totally unclear if this is the I of Christ or the I of Leisha, and I am unsure if she saw a distinction either. Now, there's another peculiar feature in the book's front matter. Lisa, or Leisha Kenning, makes clear that she is not the story's protagonist, Kathy Lee, even though they bear significant similarities. And yet the story it's in the meat of the book. She provides an email address for Kathy Lee, klee@megalink.net. And this is a real email address that Leisha managed herself. So there's an obvious slippage here between, we have a novel here and real life. What is the sort of difference? Obviously, if it's prophecy, that's the connection between the two. But so in 2006, Tuesday, the 6th of June came and went, and death did not cease within Farmington's limits, as Leisha had prophesied. But the event did get front page coverage in the local newspaper. Here we have it. Miracle prophecy fails to make an appearance. Now, this peculiar detail, the Farmington prophecy, in Lisa Bieberman and Leisha Kenning's biography, certainly raises the question that I began with. What ever happened to Lisa Bieberman? Although perhaps on a different set of terms now than before. We might now understand her move away from the psychedelic scene and the use of LSD. She became a Christian, and God told her LSD was no longer to be part of her practice. And we may know where she went, to Farmington, of course. But what to make of her idiosyncratic approach to prophetic Christianity and the religious community that she and her husband founded, that for the most part had a total membership of 4? Now, one could pose the exact same question about her acid Quakerism as I just asked about her prophetic Christianity. Her acid Quakerism is equally idiosyncratic, no doubt. And even though she belonged to a Quaker meeting at the time, her acid Quakerism was, for the most part, a church of one. Now, in many ways, her later years of Christian Quakerism, or Quaker Christianity, um, and a relatively conservative and evangelical Christianity at that, bear some surprising similarities to this earlier idiosyncratic psychedelicism. But the prophetic turn and the incredible specificity that her prophecy would materialize within the city limits of Farmington, Maine, I have been puzzling over what to make of this, as you may be as well now. Now, theologically, there is something kind of beautiful in insisting upon the arrival of the kingdom of heaven to your own town of residence. Perhaps I can't get on board with its exclusivity, but heaven must start somewhere. Why not in one's own backyard? And such inspired texts are nothing new. The Quran is such a text, as is the Book of Mormon. Now, this question of whatever happened to Lisa Bieberman may also raise questions about her sanity and the often fuzzy line between madness and truly inspired prophetic or religious experience. Although I do not think she would speak of her prophecy as an experience, but instead as the transmission of true information. So perhaps there are theological kernels, and there is a lineage of inspired literature, and the question of religious experience or madness. But I'm not sure this gets to our original question: what ever happened to Lisa? I'm not sure that we'll ever have a totally satisfactory answer to this question. If one is interested in the history of the religious use of psychedelics, or in practical questions of the religious use of psychedelics, her life and her work remain, I think, a tremendous source. And if one is interested in contemporary accounts of end times prophecy, Farmington, Farmington is a very fun text to consider. And I think it is absolutely necessary to read the two together, the psychedelics, the Quaker psychedelicism and the prophetic Christianity. One cannot separate Lisa Bieberman from Leisha Kenning as much as she may have tried to at times. There are obvious parallels, I think, between Lisa and Leisha that I have already noted. But more than that, it is such a singular account of what psychedelics might do and what kind of machines that psychedelics might plug into. If nothing else, Lisa and Leisha's lives, or life, are another tally on the board that psychedelics do not do anything in particular, but can be made to do all sorts of things. I'm not saying that her use of psychedelics in the 60s led to her prophetic inclinations some 30 years later, but if we insist that her life cannot be split in two, as we begin to answer the question of whatever happened to Lisa Bieberman, we find psychedelics that were made into sacraments, and we find the remains of a contemporary psychedelic religious movement, and we find an LSD user who became a fairly conservative, if unique, Quaker follower of Christ. Now, perhaps the lesson of whatever happened to Lisa Bieberman is a caution against the surprise that we may feel in encounters with psychedelic communities, users, or ex-users who do not fit a particular expected type. And this lesson is also a warning to anyone who suggests that psychedelics do anything in particular. That will do it. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. That was incredibly interesting. I'm sure we have people with questions. So I have a few myself, but I'd rather open the floor first. If you have a question, just raise your hand and let's dig into this a bit. I can ask one of mine to get started. Um, oh, I was just curious the extent of her relationship with Houston Smith and his involvement in the Phanerathon Projects board.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm assuming he was one of the ones who was kind of like, this is her thing, and maybe was just on the board by association. But I was just curious if you were able to glean any more information about that, or if there's a lot of information there.
Yeah. So Houston Smith's time in Cambridge was rather limited. He was on some sort of short-term arrangement with MIT. Um, between for some spell in the 60s. And I believe Bieberman got in contact with Houston Smith through Leary and Alpert in the early 60s. Um, and it seems so some of this information comes from her memoir, but she does not name Houston Smith as the house for these sessions in her memoir. She just notes him as a friend, a local friend. And I pieced this together by finding a notebook with session notes in it that notes the location, Houston's house, um, along with some other correspondence where they're going back and forth trying to plan the setting of this session. And it seemed he was just a fan of what she was up to. I think he, as a scholar of religion, was particularly attracted to her very earnest religious purposes for psychedelics, and that his place on the board, along with a number of other kind of like big names in the psychedelics and religion world in the late 60s, like Walter Houston Clark, seem mostly titular. The board did not seem to do a whole lot, and there did not seem to be a lot of like co-signing and support. Support, I think, most specifically was what she was looking for her plans.
Thank you. Yeah. I'll let Karen jump in here. Yes.
If you have a follow-up, Nathan, go ahead. You always ask good
Well,
questions.
yeah, I had one for a second, but then I kind of lost it. I guess I was just wondering, how much you think. So obviously she has this like LSD experience that is kind of like the thing that we can somewhat pinpoint as this shift into becoming more serious about Quakerism and her involvement with that and her kind of like developing this new religious kind of movement. But how much do you think if you can I'm just wondering how much her frustration with the lack of support for her project played into her decision to, which I don't know, that's maybe impossible to get any kind of read on, but that was just my thought. And then,
Yeah. I mean, yes, this is, I think, one of my big questions as well. I think it was significant. I think it was absolutely significant. Um, I mean, there are some correspondence that are with folks who I think are sort of like more bought in than others that are just devastating in their, um, as I noted earlier, tone of despondency of like nobody supports any of this stuff I'm doing. You know, my primary goal is this center where anyone can come and take a psychedelic. And some of these people who are, into it to some degree are like, who would even come? And she's like, me, obviously, and you, I would think. And then she has a list of, some other folks who have told her, they would be looking for such a thing. And there's a number of projects that they try to get off the ground along the way. They're like, okay, we don't have the money to buy some piece of land in New Hampshire or in the suburbs of Massachusetts or anywhere else to set up this center. What can we do in the meantime? Oh, let's put together a bibliography of work on psychedelics and religion. And so in other correspondence, she says, you guys proposed this project. My big thing is starting this center. Obviously, we don't have the funds, so like we'll do this other project. Nobody helped me out with it, even though it was your idea. What gives? Like, why is everything that is phenerothime have to be me? And these letters are getting sort of increasingly frustrated up to April 1971. And then with this session, I think one could interpret it as a sort of breaking point in a lot of ways in the social dynamics that comprised, the Phanerothime Society. And there was, I think, a fair degree of um, dogmatism that Bieberman had about what Phanerothime Society would be. She drafted bylaws with no other input and brought them to her group and was like, okay, everybody needs to sign these bylaws. And they were like, is there any process to like review or, make our own amendments? And she was like, this is just a formality. No, just sign. This is it. And so there's a sort of like pretty heavy hand of like, this is the vision. If you're not on board with the vision, like you're deterring me. And that is a incredibly striking parallel to her post psychedelic work. It's the same sort of problem of anybody who's not, fully on board with the vision. The first iteration of this post psychedelia was called the Publishers of Truth. If somebody was not, full in on everything that the Publishers of Truth were up to, they would be disowned. And that happened, a number of times. And so that is how, they ended up with a religious community of four. And so there are some ways where there's the same impulse that I'm seeing in both of these periods, that I think would make it rather hard to form a sort of long-lasting community. And these kind of social dynamics that were playing out as a result of that I could imagine then could bring one to the point of like, God, is this really what I'm here to do? And the word she gets is no, this is not the thing you're here to do. You're here to do something else.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I'm just thinking it's kind of a convenient just like pivot point where like she obviously has this tendency to maybe like create this narrative around herself, especially given the Farmington and how she's kind of blended into that as one of the characters. So I'm just thinking, I don't know. There's probably all sorts of things there. But Karen, thank you for letting me ask that follow-up question. And now, how about for yours?
Yeah, I liked it. Well, thank you so much for that talk. I really enjoyed it. I knew nothing of what you have just said, like very little. So that was very enlightening. I'm curious what it has been like for you to do this archival research as a person, as a researcher, maybe like some of the highs and lows, feel pardon the pun.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that question. That is, I, this I think it's a uniquely personal collection in a lot of ways. Not necessarily personal to me. I mean, it's personal to me for a number of reasons, but personal in the sense that, I'm finding receipts and bank statements and all sorts of things that, you might not find once cold for in a university library or something like that. And so there are parts of it that are like incredibly vulnerable, and that I'm sort of thinking about what's important to share as part of like this historical record, and what is not even what's not significant, but what's too much. I think particularly when we get to questions about like, is it prophecy or is it madness or something like that? That binary phrasing of the question of like, what are these things? What's the Farmington prophecy? What are these other sort of like prophetic moments along the way? What's the turn away from LSD? And putting it in those terms of like, oh, is this a sort of a mental illness, or is this like an authentic religious experience, whatever that might be? You find things that move you in one way or another, and yet are maybe our terms are too limited to like explain something based on what one finds on a piece of paper, one way or another. And as for like how I have felt going through these things, it's been a real honor, I think, in a lot of ways, to be kind of trusted to tell, to review this material and then to tell the story in some way. And so, yeah, there's like a feeling of responsibility to tell it well. And I'm not a Quaker. I have my own complex relationship with Christianity. But this material has made me think a lot about um, my own Christian pasts, and what does it mean to bring the kingdom of heaven? Like, I haven't thought about the kingdom of heaven in those kinds of terms in a long time, and being confronted very directly with somebody who thought it was coming on June 6, 2006 to a particular town. And I go, oh, what would that mean? And, if you take this, maybe not literally, but seriously, what would it mean then for somebody to take up such a mission, to like think of their town as the place where the kingdom of heaven could be made real? That's been, I think, theologically challenging in a lot of ways. And not, I think, in an abstract way of like, oh, theology sometimes can be thought of as like, how is the furniture on the deck of a sinking ship maneuvered? And even though the ship's sinking, oh, we're just going to continue to move these chairs around. It's, I think, theological in the sense of like, what are the sort of questions of ultimate concern, and how does that affect the way that you're going to live your life? Like, the bringing of the kingdom of heaven is like a very, it's very practical. It's not just a matter of desk chairs on the Titanic or something.
Can I indulge in a follow-up? But maybe
Yeah,
I'll wait to
please.
see if anyone else
I think you should ask the follow-up, Karen.
I'll
Yeah,
just do it.
we'll have plenty of time.
I'll take the privilege I granted to you. Thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds like such an intense project for you, and like so cool and challenging. And but also I didn't realize that you were planning to go into this topic of madness versus kind of spiritual, like that kind of dichotomy. And of course, like you said, the words leave something to be desired, to say the least.
Yeah.
And there is probably not as much literature as I'd love to see on that topic. I've read a little bit about, mental health, definitions of sanity and ecstasy. And
Mhm.
I'm interested in awe and ecstatic moments, and there's not so much on that, and definitely not a contemporary, like related to the psychedelic movement right now as well. So are you planning to focus on that in your writing, or dedicate some time to that theoretical work?
Yes, very much so. There is a great book that came out, in the last 10 years, but translated to English more recently, called A Philosophy of Madness by Wouter Koesters. The subtitle is The Experience of Psychotic Thinking, and this is written by a fellow who's had his own history of mental illness himself, and is drawing on some of that for this book. So there are resources out there, no doubt. And there is, so my master's thesis research was on the founder of hospital chaplaincy. Yes, the author calls himself a card-carrying member, exactly. So my master's research was on the founder of hospital chaplaincy, a guy named Anton Boyson, whose idea for clinical chaplaincy emerges during a 15-month stay in a mental hospital in 1920 to 1922. And so he comes up with the idea of chaplaincy as a response to his experience in an asylum, and thinking that he's having a set of religious experiences, but is not permitted the opportunity to think about or talk about those experiences on religious or theological terms. You're in the hospital, you're being confronted by doctors and nurses, and nobody is interested in, is there theological import with the experience that I'm having. And so chaplaincy then was this way of bringing in a theological or religious conversation into mental hospital spaces so that patients could understand their experience on a different set of terms besides pathology. And hospital chaplaincy is not necessarily doing that in quite the same way today, but I think this kind of person, or this person in particular, the founder of hospital chaplaincy, Anton Boysen, provides a tremendous set of resources from the ground up. From the ground up, meaning from the perspective of a patient, and not just the perspective of a patient, but perspective of a person who's made into a patient and made to understand one's experiences on the terms of a patient, and what are the other ways that one moves through the world besides being a patient. And so connected to this work on Bieberman, she was a mental health patient herself, among many other things. And so one could very easily read this story through a set of diagnostics and these sorts of things. But I think that's not particularly interesting. And so hopefully there will be an essay coming out at some point about this sort of problem of madness in chaplaincy. And I think that would go quite well along with something on Bieberman and this sort of split between prophetic experience and mental illness. And whether it's one or the other or both, what does that, I'm reading Farmington, and it's convicting in a number of ways. What might it mean to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth or something like that. And I think the fact that it is convicting it affords the possibility that we don't just have to write these sorts of accounts off that may be understood otherwise as psychosis or something like that. And it's interesting in the history of psychedelics that the term psychotomimetic was rejected for this exact reason, that we don't want to think about these drugs as psychosis mimicking. One, because they weren't particularly good at the thing that they thought psychosis mimicking was. You give LSD to not a patient, but a clinician to help understand their patient. And whoops, turns out the LSD experience perhaps is not as much like the experience of a person with schizophrenia as we thought initially. And yet, can we make the next step and say, okay, perhaps the LSD experience is not like psychosis or, some other form of mental illness. But can we grant the permission to folks whose experience we have labeled psychosis and say, oh, what else is happening here? We can do that for LSD or psilocybin or mescaline. Can we do that for, human beings?
Excellent. Other questions?
Yeah, I can jump on
Cool.
for a second. You might have already made a statement on this, but I cut out there for a moment. But I was wondering, for this work to kind of extend the research, would you ever consider interviewing people in Farmington, just to kind of go around and see? I know you've been doing a lot of archival work, but I was thinking I'm assuming there would be a lot of people still alive and present there, who might have brushed up against her.
When I've been to Farmington, I've asked basically everyone I met about this story, and no one knew what I was talking about, which is peculiar. And maybe I'm just asking the wrong people, and people, who weren't in Farmington 20 years ago, and I just need to ask some more folks. But to answer your question quickly, yes, it is ongoing, and it's something I need to do more of, certainly.
Mhm.
But there's been, a little bit, I've dipped my toe in this and I haven't come up with much yet. So certainly more to come.
I was thinking about a couple people here at the University of Ottawa who are doing research. Sheldamar and crew, when they went down and they were doing research about interviewing people who participate in the MK Ultra program and everything like that. And I remember them saying that they had like a lot of difficulty at first when they found like that one in person. It was like it seemed like there's nothing there, and they found that one person that was like the in, and then all of a sudden it like kind of exploded open. So, maybe there's nothing there, but that just kind of evoked a very similar kind of experience that they had.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we were talking a little bit about this before we began, but there is, I think, a real pressing need for oral histories of folks who were around, in this period. And there are more projects than we could go through right now of what that work is. Was it folks who were at, the Esalen workshops of Stanley Roth, or, people who were unwittingly involved in CIA research, or, people in these religious communities, whether it was Millbrook or the Church of the Awakening or the Neo-American Church or Phanerothime Society. Yeah, I think there's a huge pressing need for that oral history work to be done as soon as possible, because these folks are getting up in years, no doubt.
Bridget?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for archival research. So I just like last week, I'm planning to study the use of psychedelics for training of healthcare professionals. And I just found out last week that the archive for the LSD training studies from the 1970s are available online at Purdue University. So I'm kind of digging through those.
That's great.
But I'm a physician myself who's now studying this, so I don't have background. So if you have any advice for somebody doing archival research.
Yeah. It's incredible that they've digitized some of that stuff at Purdue. Purdue's library is such an incredible resource on this period. They have Penke's papers, they have a number of Groff's papers, they have, all sorts of treasures there. I think one piece of advice that I was given that I try to follow as much as I can is, you'll have your set of questions when you come in to an archive about what you're hoping to find answers to. It might be particular sort of factual details about, this, that, and the other thing. It may be sort of more abstract questions about, like, whatever happened to Lisa Bieberman. This was one of my questions. But the archive will have its own set of questions that it will press onto you, some of which will come with answers and others of which will not. And this is the advice that I was given, that you must listen to what the archive has to say to you, rather than insisting on it to answer the questions that you come with it to respond to. So many archives are incomplete. If it's correspondence, there's the sort of concrete details of, did they save their correspondence they sent or just the ones that they received? You have an incomplete set of letters. People have been wrestling over that with the New Testament for 2,000 years, as so many of what became the New Testament are letters. We can only wonder, what were the letters that Paul was getting that he was then responding to? So there's those sorts of kind of concrete gaps. And then I think particularly with like institutional archives, like if you're dealing with hospital records or police records, or, if you're going far back and you're interested in, like, for example, the history of peyote or psilocybin in the New World, you're dealing with, Spanish Inquisitional records. There's a great book. It's about other things, but one of the things it's about is archival research called Sins Against Nature by Zeb Tortorici. And he notes that the archive that he's working in, it's Spanish Inquisitional records. Every character that you are encountering in that archive is facing the worst day of their life, in front of the Inquisition, in what is now Mexico. And so when we are thinking about the people that we're encountering, like, oh, were they good people? Were they bad people? What's happening to them? And what did people think they did wrong? And how is that being responded to? The same with the medical record, what brings somebody into the ED, whether it's a police officer or somebody else, and then what happens to them. And same with, I think those two, the Inquisition and medical records, you're encountering people often on one of the worst days of their life. And so that, I think, is really, crucial to sort of keep in mind, like, what do you do with this material? It's like I was saying earlier, it's very vulnerable and intimate. And often, you're not getting their story, you're getting, the physician or the police officer or the Inquisition executors side of the story. And I think with the collection that you're looking at, with the archive that you're wading into, it's, I think, not quite, those points are not quite as pressing, but I think it is important that you, depending on what you have, what is available to you, you may not get the trip reports as they were written by participants. The manual will be the manual written by clinicians. All of the experiences, good, bad, and ugly, that went to inform each of those manuals will be informing it, but left out. And one can only wonder, what are those lacunae?
They're actually very intense and detailed. Like, some of them are 20 pages long. I don't think that will be appropriate for the research I'm doing, but they also have like 6 months letters written in and questionnaires, and that's the portion I'm personally more intrigued. It's very rich data for anybody who's interested.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think one thing with questionnaires fascinate me for a number of reasons. The history of questionnaires, I think, is really important to keep in mind. I'm not sure if this book has been written yet, but if it is, somebody should point me towards it or write it. When did we start to decide that a questionnaire was the way to access another person's inner world? What are the sort of factors at play in thinking? And then now it's sort of just assumed, oh, we want to know what's going on with, between the ears of X, Y, or Z person. Well, we'll give them a set of questions, they'll respond, and then maybe we won't know, but we'll have an idea. And then we put those questionnaires next to a bunch of other questionnaires that have been responded to, and we can, do something with that information.
Well, that's such an interesting point, because it seems like a lot of people ignored the questionnaire, but
interesting.
the question prompts and wrote letters.
Wow.
So I'm not sure what they were asked, but it's like, I finally found the questionnaire and I thought, oh, actually they're answering the questionnaire, but they've just decided to write their own letter. So perhaps this was the time that the questionnaire was being developed.
I feel like, thank goodness I had former life as a poli-sci student. I think a lot of the questionnaire stuff relates to population control and data collection about populations, especially if you think about like anthropologically, like collecting data demographically. And then if you combine that with commercial interests, it's an extremely efficient way to gather data in a capitalist context. So polling was also a former life. But that would be a great book, and I'd love to read it.
Yeah. And there's been a little bit of work on this around the FDA. There's a book, I can't remember the name of it, but the author's name is Matthew Oram, on clinical trials of psychedelics in the 60s. And one of the reasons questionnaires were introduced, particularly around psychedelic research, was the founding or the change in the evaluation by the FDA of new drugs. That you have to evaluate a new drug for a condition, and you can't just test anybody to see if it works. You have to test people with that condition, which means you need some replicable way to decide whether people have that condition, which is particularly challenging in a number of psychiatric diagnoses when we don't have a biological index to decide what a disease is. So a questionnaire is a great way to decide if somebody has a particular disease. So there, the questionnaire becomes very important to replicate data in the shape that the FDA will then use to evaluate drugs. So anyways, certainly more for that. And thank you for that background.
Yeah, Matthew Oram also has two great papers. If somebody can't get his book, he has two papers on
Who is
this
that?
subject. Matthew Oram.
Okay.
His work is great.
Yeah.
This is kind of shifting gears, but I had one more question. But does anybody else have anyone want to go first? I don't want to ask too many. Okay. It's more of just like a general thing, but I was just curious about To Mark a Spot and what the work is like in terms of trying to get that published, and if there's any sort of a timeline or anything, or if it's kind of nebulous.
No timeline at the moment. There is, well, let's say in the next 5 years. That's a reasonable timeline. I think in the next 5 years will definitely be doable. There's some open questions as to whether Lisa intended to shorten the book further, that she just never got around to. She had attempted to publish it quite. She sent it to probably, I don't know, over 20 publishers in the 70s, in the mid 70s. First to see if she could collect in advance to then write the book, to no avail. And then she finished the manuscript because she got advice that first-time authors have a very hard time getting books published, or getting in advance, without a manuscript. And so she was like, okay, well, I'll just write the whole thing. She wrote the whole thing. Nobody was biting. Got some advice from some folks that, well, unanimously people were like, you need to make this book half as long. It's way too long. It needs to be half as long. I read this over and over and over again from publishers' letters back to her. This book needs to be half as long. And she responded quite late in her sort of work on this book project, that yes, I have plans to make it shorter. There were other folks who were saying, this Christian stuff at the end is so weird. Do you think you could just get rid of it or make it another book? And she was like, I can't make it another book because the end of this story is my conversion and ceasing of taking psychedelics. Like that's the story. And the story is about my life. I lived this life. If I write a different story, it wouldn't be my life. And so it wouldn't be a memoir. And so all that said, there are some questions around, to what extent can changes be made to this manuscript prior to publication? And if so, what kind of changes? Obviously not to any plot points, but, we have these very long sections about cars that she was driving at various periods. Do we need every detail about the 64 AMC Rambler that she drove? There's one scene that's particularly important, but maybe not every, notice of every car. So for all of those reasons, figuring out, what can work. And with Lisa's widower, Bieberman died in 2022. She survived by her husband. And so working with him to sort of feel out, what feels right, what are acceptable, can we do Oxford commas? Can we make Oxford commas? as a change. I think that's a great idea. I'm a bit of a dogmatist about the Oxford comma. So yeah, for all those reasons, within 5 years, I think is reasonable.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that seems incredibly challenging in a different way than the archival work, but that's exciting. That's exciting stuff. Do we have any other questions? All right.
I have a question.
Okay.
I'm curious. I have my own thoughts about this, but I'm curious if this um, theology of LSD is attractive to anyone. Does anyone, if as you encounter a little bit, a taste of this material, think, oh, maybe I would be interested in this like Christian use of LSD? Is this something that's compelling at all to anyone? Is it, do we reject it out of hand? This is not something I'm interested in all, but I'm glad she was up to what she was up to. I'd be curious if there's any sort of like responses any which way to this, both this practice and this sort of theology that came with the practice.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think the question that popped into my mind when thinking about this kind of thing was the concept of the theology, if it reifies orthodoxy or if it reinterprets and it's a heterodox. Because like the reason why I think with that is that this is just me speaking totally off the cuff from like what I see around. There is an interesting dynamic where there's some people in the like psychedelic culture who stay in it or leave it, and then some go, very orthodox after. Others have a very heterodox. For example, like my background and everything is in studying Buddhism. I think about right now. There's the psychedelic sangha in New York that's self-describes as heterodox, and there's other groups who are trying to get more orthodox acceptance. So I think that dynamic and how that emerges is super interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what are we? Yeah, trying to make a call from inside the house or shouting from the outside.
I mean, I don't know if I would be. I'm definitely glad she was doing what she was doing, and I definitely want to learn more about the kind of system she created. Even the six rules, that was very interesting to me. Um, yeah, but I don't know. Does anyone else have any responses? That might have made me think of one more.
Well,
Well, this is
it did seem like she had some parameters about how often to use and intention, but there wasn't like and maybe I missed it, sort of like a service that once you had this insight, there was like make sure it's a good insight, but there wasn't sort of a call to service.
Yes. Yeah, and I think you could find, if you wanted to, a call to service implicit in the sixth rule that if you receive a leading from God, be sure to carry it out. If you receive a clear leading from God, be sure to carry it out, but make sure it's clear. And a leading, could be any number of things. Quit your job, get a new job, end a particular relationship, commit oneself to simplicity, or things that are sort of more service oriented or more politically oriented, like this in the case of Lisa, not from a Phanerothime session but from other experiences. I'm not going to pay my full taxes because I don't support American war adventurism, so I'm going to reduce my federal taxes to the level that I think do not include any money that goes to the federal government for war. That was a leading she got, and she carried it out to her own trouble as the IRS repossessed her car as payment in kind for her unpaid income taxes. So I think in that you can pull out a service-oriented commitment in the practice.
I'm curious. Well, I guess one thing was the session games people play got just like passed over, but all the list of the games was kind of funny and made me want to like actually look into that. Is that like, would you say that's related to the theology at all? Because it almost seemed like not like a list of sins or something, but because it was like, don't do these things, right?
Right. Yes. Yes. It's all don't do. The reason it's a negative manual rather than a positive manual is because, let's see here. Given good preparation and knowledge of what not to do, what to do should not be a problem. I don't have to tell you what to do. You're going to know. What not to do are the things that you may have less trouble discerning, with any immediacy. There is not a Christianity is not apparent in the session games, and it's very much pre-Christian, pre-fall 68. And I like the idea that the things of what to do are going to come naturally. The guidelines that you might need are, what not to do. And what are these games? If you haven't read it before, for example, one of the games is Where's Harry? Where's Harry is basically the game where you run away from your group. Pretty good rule. The first game that she mentions, I think she says it's the most common game, is Get Me Out of This. This sense of like, I don't like how I'm feeling. I'm going to try and pretend everything's normal or terminate the session or something. So that's a no-go. You can't end a session. Once you're in it, you're in it. There's another game that's quite similar to that called Let's Call It a Day, where you try to end a session early. Like, oh, an LSD, hour 6, I'm feeling fine. I'm going to, proceed as if things are over. No, you need to wait all 16 hours. Or I have all the answers. Rather apparent, the feeling that you have all the answers. Avoid such an activity. So for that reason, I think, it still makes tremendous practical sense. I have an article in review right now, written with some friends from University of Michigan, who did some survey work on the session games, assessing whether contemporary psychedelic communities consider this advice still worth following. And in great part, most of it is like, yeah, this looks good to us. Hopefully we'll see the light of day at some point soon, but
yeah, most of it seems pretty practical from what you were mentioning.
Yeah, no doubt.
Do you mind? Can I jump in for a second? I had as you're talking about the session games, I also find super interesting that list, because that's the first time I ever saw them. But I was thinking as you're saying, this is like her pre-Christian era, and I thought, what if perhaps there is already an implicit Christianity, because just the framing of thou shall nots, that's at least in my opinion, I believe that's a very Christian framing, in that deliberate, that as you call it, that psychedelic pedagogy that she's giving.
Yes.
Now I would say that, very Protestant Christian culture, you could, be like that kind of rules framings kind of already baked into the culture, which maybe that's more the influence, but it's curious, I think.
That there is, yes, a sense of like, if we're taking LSD, we should have some rules. What is this? That initial impulse, can we sort of track that to a Protestant culture or something like that? Yeah, perhaps. And I think was an I think, an exceptional attitude of its time, where so much of the use of psychedelics was in this moment. a permission granted for any kind of behavior, for better or for worse. Maybe there are good parts of that, maybe there are not so good parts of that. Not something I need to, rule on in this moment. But we can say that if that was the state of affairs, coming in and saying, maybe if we put some guardrails up and just not even say, thou shalt not do this. It is what is it? What does she open with? So you're going to take LSD. Now, if you're going to take LSD, here's some things I've learned based on my own experience. A number of things not to do. Is it a result of a Protestant culture? Is it a reaction to the no holds barred psychedelic culture? Whatever it is, there's a reason that versions of it continue to circulate on all manner of anarchist and psychedelic websites to this day. It seems to continue to speak to people for whatever reason. Also, and this is just something fun, she provides a graph she calls how high you are, or that's at least the y-axis. Now, there's no units, of course. You can't measure how high you are in units, but it is a very helpful graph that I appreciate.
It's kind of interesting looking at that, and you mentioned like Leary being a foil, and then like how the psychedelic experience was written. Because I mean, I know there were kind of like suggestions of what not to do in that book, but from what I remember, it was way more like, here's what you should do. Like, here's this structure that we have devised, and like, here's a map to the experience.
Yes.
And then she's taking that
Leary's
opposite.
book. Yes.
Yeah, she's taking the opposite kind of stance of like, it will do what it needs to do as long as you stay within these parameters or don't do these certain things.
Yes. And she speaks to this this pamphlet came out after the Psychedelic Experience, a manual for the use of psychedelics based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And let's see here. When she talks about preparation. Okay. Let's see. One hears a lot about preparation for the LSD experience. You may wonder what sort of preparation you should undergo. Actually, you have been preparing all your life, and those many years of preparation will outweigh anything you can do in a short time before the session. Being told to prepare for a session is a little like being told to prepare to meet your maker a few hours before you're going to be shot. If there is any last-minute preparation for the LSD experience, it would be in the nature of refreshing in your mind the things that are dearest and most sacred to you. Now, this is really where she's coming at Leary, I think. Don't plunge into Oriental philosophy unless you are already a lover of it. Psychedelic state is no more Eastern than Western. Think about the things you care about, the people you love, the things you hope to do with your life. A good conscience is the best preparation you can have.
Yeah, shots fired for sure.
That meet your maker
That's
phrase
so
that's gold. You said that like, okay, I get why you're looking into all of this.
Yeah. And there, you do get a little bit of cultural Christianity there. Oh, here is a direct call out to the specifically that psychedelic experience book. Let's see here. I have known people to take too much LSD because they feel they have not yet achieved an ego death or a first bardo. Forget all about levels. They are pretty meaningless. You will learn that the LSD state is for you after what the LSD state is for you after several sessions. Don't worry if it isn't like somebody else's description. You cannot compare how high you are compared to how high Joe is. So go by the clock. If nothing remarkable has happened after an hour and a half, Now this language, we would use something different today, but she says, you got gypped.
Yeah.
So yes, the specific, the ego death in the first bardo, and this sense of like, perhaps somebody somewhere, I won't say who, has prepared a vision for what the psychedelic experience is or can be, through a bardo or an ego death or whatever else. Maybe that's great for them. Maybe your sense that you're having a different time is totally okay. No need to make such an experience fit with any number of bardos.
Yeah, I like that because I was writing about like these kind of attempts to map the psychedelic experience a lot, and it's almost like anti-mapping. It's like she's just like, okay, yeah, it's gonna present itself in whatever way it does for you. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that there's not a map, or that she is providing a set of navigational tools rather than handing you the map. Here's a compass and a sleeping bag, rather than, here's your final destination.
Totally. All right. Thank you, Paul. This was really fun. Yeah.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Thanks for the
Excited to see.
invitation. My pleasure. It's great to be here.
Yeah, definitely. Excited to see where it keeps going. So definitely keep us updated as things happen and we can spread through our little network, get the,
For sure.
yeah. Cool. All right. Well, I will stop the recording and then, yeah, talk.